The day a system throws something away is often the day someone else discovers what it was really worth. On a cold Tuesday morning in late October of 1994, the loading dock behind Clearwater Packing House outside Idaho Falls, Idaho, came to a standstill for exactly 12 minutes while a forklift operator tried to decide where to put 50 tons of potatoes nobody wanted. They were healthy potatoes. They had grown in rich volcanic soil, pulled nutrients from the same Snake River plain that had built Idaho's reputation one harvest after another, and they carried exactly the same starch content as every premium russet rolling towards supermarkets across the country. The only thing wrong with them was their appearance. Some curved too sharply. Some had deep eyes that automated grading cameras disliked. Others had grown into shapes that reminded inspectors of dumbbells, crescents, or oversized pears instead of the smooth, symmetrical form expected by grocery chains. To the packing house, appearance was not a detail. Appearance was the product. Every truck entering the facility was measured against specifications negotiated months before harvest. Length, diameter, surface finish, skin quality, uniformity. If a potato missed too many of those categories, it stopped being produce and became a problem. That Tuesday, nearly 50 tons became one enormous problem. Let me tell you about Clearwater Packing House before I tell you about the woman standing quietly beside those trailers, because you need to understand the world before you can understand why this story exists. For more than 3 decades, the facility had been one of eastern Idaho's largest potato buyers. Hundreds of family farms depended on contracts written months before planting, and every contract revolved around one assumption that nobody questioned anymore. Grocery stores sold perfection, not food. Consumers bought with their eyes before they bought with their kitchens. The grading lines reflected that belief with mechanical precision. Cameras scanned every potato. Rollers sorted by size. Air jets redirected anything that failed cosmetic standards. The machines did not know flavor. They did not measure starch density. They did not care how well a potato would bake or mash or roast. They only knew the dimensions programmed into their software and the standards demanded by national retailers. On most harvest days, rejected loads represented only a small inconvenience. Farmers sold them cheaply for livestock feed, industrial starch, or simply accepted the loss as another cost of doing business. Nobody argued with the system because the system had always worked. At least, everyone believed it had. That morning, however, one rejected shipment was too large to disappear quietly. Forklifts moved around it. Managers checked paperwork twice. Drivers leaned against trailers waiting for instructions that never seemed to come. And standing just beyond the yellow safety line, wearing a faded canvas work jacket, worn leather gloves, and a seed company cap nearly 10 years old, was a 41-year-old potato grower named Grace Whitmore. She never raised her voice. She never protested the rejection. She simply watched another inspector stamp rejected across the final page, folded the paperwork once, slipped it into her coat pocket, and asked a question so unexpected that the dock's supervisor stopped writing for a moment before answering. "If I take every last pound back today," she asked, "does the packing house still own any part of what those potatoes become tomorrow?" The supervisor smiled politely, assuming she was joking. He had no idea that the answer to that question would become the beginning of a waiting list stretching farther than anyone on that loading dock could possibly imagine. The truth was that no farmer in eastern Idaho planted potatoes for a packing house alone, even if it sometimes felt that way. They planted for a system that had been growing larger and more standardized with every passing decade, a system that connected seed breeders, fertilizer dealers, irrigation districts, trucking companies, storage warehouses, processors, wholesalers, grocery chains, and finally the customer pushing a shopping cart beneath bright supermarket lights hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Every decision made in the field months earlier echoed all the way through that chain. Variety selection determined shape. Irrigation timing influenced skin finish. Soil temperature affected growth rate. Harvest conditions influenced bruising. Storage humidity changed shelf life. By the time a potato reached a grading line, most of its future had already been decided long before anyone looked at it. Let me tell you about Idaho potato country in the 1994 harvest season because you need to understand why nobody questioned those decisions. The Snake River Plain had become one of the most productive potato regions in North America not by accident, but through decades of careful engineering. Massive irrigation canals carried mountain snowmelt across fields that otherwise would have remained dry sagebrush. Volcanic soils provided exceptional drainage while retaining enough nutrients to support high yields. University extension specialists worked closely with growers to improve disease management, storage techniques, and fertilizer programs. New harvesting equipment reduced labor while increasing efficiency. Every improvement pushed growers toward greater consistency, because consistency was what buyers rewarded. Contracts rarely promised bonuses for extraordinary flavor or unusually high starch content. They rewarded loads that fit predictable specifications. Uniform potatoes filled shipping cartons more efficiently, moved through mechanical peeling equipment more smoothly, and looked better beneath grocery store lighting. Those economic incentives quietly shaped nearly every planting decision across the region. A farmer could spend an entire season producing potatoes with remarkable cooking quality, but if too many emerged with unusual curves, oversized shoulders, deep eyes, or irregular profiles, their market value could collapse almost overnight. Nobody believed the system was cruel. They believed it was practical. Grocery buyers wanted reliability. Distributors wanted efficiency. Consumers expected familiar shapes without ever realizing they had been trained to expect them. Over time, that expectation hardened into something resembling natural law. Farmers talked about cosmetic grading the same way they talked about weather. They might complain about it during coffee at the local diner, but they still planned their lives around it because they assumed it could not be changed. Every autumn, thousands of tons of perfectly edible potatoes quietly disappeared into lower-value markets. Some became dehydrated flakes. Some entered industrial starch production. Some were sold for livestock feed. Others never justified the transportation costs required to move them anywhere at all. Entire conversations about food quality revolved around appearance instead of chemistry, nutrition, or flavor, because appearance was the easiest thing to measure quickly on a conveyor belt moving thousands of pounds every hour. That was the invisible rule governing nearly every farm surrounding Idaho Falls in 1994. Nobody woke each morning intending to waste potential. They simply accepted a definition of value that had been repeated for so many years it no longer sounded like an opinion. It sounded like fact. And standing just outside that definition, without announcing it to anyone, Grace Whitmore had begun wondering whether the grading system understood potatoes nearly as well as it believed it did. Let me tell you about Grace Whitmore, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand the decision she was preparing to make. Grace was 41 years old in the fall of 1994 and had spent her entire life on the same 620-acre farm 20 miles northwest of Idaho Falls. The land had entered the Whitmore family in 1948 when her grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, returned from military service with little more than determination, a used tractor, and enough savings to purchase 160 acres that most local farmers considered too rocky to justify the price. Samuel believed something different. He believed good soil was not something a man found. It was something a family built one careful season at a time. He spent years removing volcanic stones by hand, improving irrigation ditches, rotating crops, and recording every harvest in a weathered leather ledger that still rested on a shelf inside the farmhouse office. His son, Thomas Whitmore, inherited both the farm and the habit of keeping records. Thomas expanded the operation field by field through the 1960s and 1970s, purchasing neighboring parcels whenever another family retired. He was known throughout Bonneville County as a patient grower rather than an aggressive businessman. While other farmers often spoke first about market prices, Thomas usually spoke about soil temperature, water timing, and storage humidity because he believed profits followed good decisions instead of the other way around. Grace grew up listening to those conversations across the kitchen table every evening. She learned multiplication by calculating irrigation schedules, learned geography by reading shipping destinations on produce boxes, and learned responsibility long before she could legally drive a pickup truck. Every Saturday morning, her father handed her a clipboard and asked her to count storage bins, inspect ventilation fans, and compare inventory with handwritten records. Whenever she found potatoes with unusual shapes, she asked why they looked different from the others. Thomas never called them defective. He simply said that nature had more imagination than grocery stores. That sentence stayed with Grace far longer than either of them realized. After graduating from high school, She enrolled at the University of Idaho, where she studied food science instead of agricultural business. Many people expected her to return home with better marketing ideas or improved production methods. Instead, she became fascinated by what happened after harvest. She spent long afternoons in laboratory courses studying starch composition, fermentation, food chemistry, and the invisible biological processes that transformed ordinary crops into products with entirely different identities. She visited research facilities, attended extension seminars, and filled notebooks with observations that had little to do with growing potatoes and everything to do with understanding what they could become. When she returned to the family farm, she did not announce a grand plan or criticize the way anyone else worked. She quietly resumed harvest alongside her father, repaired irrigation equipment, monitored storage temperatures, and continued adding notes to her grandfather's old ledger beside records that now stretched back nearly half a century. Most neighbors assumed Grace had simply returned to continue the family operation exactly as it had always been. They saw another potato farmer carrying another clipboard across another field in another Idaho autumn. What they did not see were the books stacked beside her kitchen table every winter, the pages marked with careful notes about fermentation science, small batch distillation, regional food products, and one simple question that refused to leave her mind. If appearance determined price, what determined value? Let me tell you about the winter that quietly changed the direction of Grace Whitmore's life because it happened years before anyone at the packing house knew her name. During the winter of 1990, after the harvest had been stored and the irrigation pumps had fallen silent beneath the first snow, Grace drove nearly 300 miles to attend a regional food science conference at Oregon State University. Most of the audience consisted of researchers, extension specialists, and small food manufacturers discussing grain fermentation, fruit processing, and value-added agriculture. Potatoes appeared only briefly on the schedule, tucked into a technical presentation delivered by Professor Daniel Mercer, a food chemist who had spent more than 15 years studying starch conversion in root crops. The lecture room held fewer than 40 people that afternoon. Several attendees left early for another session on food packaging, but Grace remained in the front row filling page after page of a spiral notebook. Professor Mercer explained that potatoes contained one of the highest starch concentrations among common food crops, and that starch itself was simply stored energy, waiting for the correct biological process to unlock it. When enzymes broke long starch molecules into fermentable sugars, ordinary yeast could convert those sugars into alcohol with remarkable efficiency. Cosmetic appearance never entered the equation. A potato with deep eyes, uneven curves, or unusual proportions contained essentially the same starch chemistry as one selected for a premium grocery display. The microorganisms performing fermentation could not recognize shape. They responded only to available carbohydrates, temperature, oxygen control, and time. Grace underlined that sentence twice. Let me tell you about what fascinated her, because this is where the story truly began to move in a different direction. She spent the following months reading technical journals from the American Society of Brewing Chemists, agricultural extension bulletins from Idaho and Washington, and research papers describing small craft distilleries that transform surplus crops into premium spirits. She learned that successful vodka production depended on consistent starch content, careful enzymatic conversion, controlled fermentation temperatures, precise distillation, and patient filtration. None of those stages required a perfectly shaped potato. In fact, once potatoes were washed, milled, cooked, and processed into mash, their external appearance disappeared completely. The chemistry remained exactly the same. That realization refused to leave her mind. Every harvest season, she watched truckloads of irregular potatoes disappear into low-value markets, while grocery stores charged premium prices for visual perfection. To everyone else, those were two unrelated facts. To Grace, they slowly became two halves of the same unanswered question. She never announced her observations at grower meetings because she understood how established industries viewed unconventional ideas. Instead, she quietly visited two family-owned craft distilleries during vacations, asked respectful questions, collected equipment catalogs, and compared production costs with potato market reports from the Idaho Agricultural Statistics Service. Each notebook became thicker than the last, filled with calculations, flow diagrams, yield estimates, and handwritten reminders connecting farming with food science in ways most growers had never considered. By the autumn of 1994, when those rejected trailers waited outside the loading dock, Grace was no longer looking at 50 tons of irregular potatoes. She was looking at thousands of gallons of untapped potential that every grading camera had been designed to ignore. Let me tell you about the science, because everything Grace Whitmore believed depended on chemistry rather than optimism. A potato is not valuable because it is round. It is valuable because of what is stored beneath its skin. Nearly 70 to 80% of a fresh potato is water, but the remaining dry matter is dominated by starch, long chains of glucose molecules that the plant builds during the growing season through photosynthesis. Every sunny afternoon, potato leaves capture sunlight, combine carbon dioxide from the air with water delivered through the roots, and slowly store that energy inside underground tubers as microscopic starch granules. Those starch granules do not care whether the potato grows straight, curved, wide, narrow, smooth, or deeply ridged. Shape is determined by growing conditions, genetics, soil resistance, moisture fluctuations, and countless environmental variables. Starch concentration follows an entirely different biological process. That distinction was the foundation of everything Grace had been studying for years. Before fermentation could begin, potatoes first had to be washed, chopped, and cooked until heat caused the starch granules to swell and gelatinize. Once gelatinized, carefully selected enzymes converted those long starch molecules into shorter fermentable sugars, primarily maltose and glucose. Without that enzymatic conversion, ordinary yeast could not use the stored energy locked inside the potato. With it, billions of yeast cells suddenly gained access to a rich food source. Let me tell you about those microorganisms, because they quietly performed the transformation that grocery stores never considered. During fermentation, yeast consumed dissolved sugars and converted them into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and hundreds of trace flavor compounds through entirely natural metabolic pathways. The yeast did not recognize cosmetic grading standards. It did not distinguish between a perfectly symmetrical potato and one rejected for having an unusual curve. As long as sugar concentration, temperature, acidity, oxygen exposure, and nutrient balance remained within proper ranges, fermentation followed the same predictable biological process. After several days, the fermented liquid contained alcohol along with water and naturally occurring compounds produced during fermentation. Distillation then separated those components according to differences in boiling temperature. Alcohol vapor rose first, traveled through a condenser, cooled back into liquid form, and became progressively cleaner with each carefully controlled distillation stage. Modern filtration removed remaining impurities while preserving the smooth character expected from premium vodka. By the time the finished spirit entered a glass bottle, nothing about the original appearance of the potatoes remained except the energy they had stored while growing beneath an Idaho sky months earlier. That was the remarkable contradiction Grace could never ignore. The grading line judged potatoes almost entirely by appearance, while fermentation depended almost entirely upon chemistry. One system valued symmetry, the other valued starch. Those priorities rarely overlapped. Agricultural research from universities across the Pacific Northwest consistently showed that tuber size and external shape alone were poor indicators of starch availability for fermentation, particularly when crops remained healthy and free from disease. Yet year after year, thousands of perfectly usable potatoes entered lower-value markets simply because they looked different from what supermarket displays demanded. Grace never believed the packing house was dishonest. She believed it was solving one problem exceptionally well while overlooking another opportunity entirely. And standing beside those rejected trailers in the autumn of 1994, she realized that the difference between waste and opportunity might be nothing more than understanding which science mattered for the product someone intended to create. Grace Whitmore drove the rejected load back to the family farm before sunset, and by the following morning, every available storage bay held potatoes that almost everyone else had already assigned a lower value. Her father stood beside the unloading conveyor without saying much. Thomas Whitmore had spent more than 30 years watching agricultural markets rise and fall, and he understood that arguing with a grading decision would accomplish nothing. What he did not understand was why his daughter had willingly accepted the transportation costs, storage costs, and financial risk of bringing home 50 tons that another buyer had already declined. Grace waited until the final truck had been emptied before she spread several notebooks across the workbench inside the machine shed. She showed him production estimates, equipment quotations, licensing requirements, projected starch yields, fermentation schedules, and cash flow calculations that she had quietly assembled over nearly 4 years. This was not an idea that had appeared overnight. It was a plan that had been growing silently through every winter after harvest. Let me tell you about what happened next, because this was the first time Grace allowed anyone else to see how completely she had thought the process through. She explained that she did not intend to sell potatoes anymore. She intended to sell craftsmanship built from potatoes. There was an enormous difference between the two. Commodity crops competed almost entirely on volume and appearance. A carefully produced regional spirit competed on quality, identity, and story. One truckload of potatoes sold as produce generated only a narrow profit margin after seed, fertilizer, irrigation, fuel, labor, storage, transportation, and grading deductions. A carefully distilled premium product had the potential to create far more value from the same biological material, provided the production met strict quality standards. Thomas studied every page without interrupting. He checked the figures twice, compared projected yields with storage records, and finally asked only one question. He asked whether she truly believed the science was stronger than the market. Grace answered that she believed the science would eventually create a different market. During the following weeks, she visited state regulators, met with attorneys familiar with alcohol production licensing, contacted equipment manufacturers, and spoke with accountants who specialized in agricultural businesses. Almost every conversation ended with polite skepticism. Some people suggested selling the potatoes for livestock feed before storage losses reduced their value further. Others recommended signing a better contract the following season instead of attempting something completely unfamiliar. A local banker reviewed her proposal carefully before admitting that he had never financed a potato farm transitioning into craft distillation. He did not reject the idea outright. He simply called it unusually ambitious. Word traveled quickly through neighboring farms because rural communities have always shared information faster than official reports. At coffee shops and equipment dealerships, people began repeating variations of the same observation. Grace Whitmore had gone to college, come home with too many books, and now intended to build a business from potatoes the grocery stores refused to display. Nobody spoke with anger. Most smiled with quiet disbelief because they assumed practical farming followed established patterns for a reason. Grace listened without arguing. Every evening she returned to her notebooks, adjusted another calculation, reviewed another regulation, and refined another production estimate. She understood that convincing people with opinions would be difficult. Convincing them with a finished bottle would be much easier. What she still did not know was how long that proof would take, or whether the first person willing to believe in her idea would arrive before her savings disappeared. The first bottles left the small production room in the spring of 1996 with plain cream-colored labels, simple black lettering, and no advertising budget beyond the conversations Grace Whitmore could start herself. She loaded cases into the back of her pickup truck and spent weeks driving across Idaho, Wyoming, and western Montana introducing the product to independent restaurant owners, specialty food shops, and small liquor retailers who were willing to taste something made close to home instead of ordering another nationally recognized brand. Most meetings ended politely. Buyers complimented the craftsmanship but questioned whether customers would pay premium prices for a spirit made from potatoes that had once fallen outside grocery specifications. Grace never argued with them. She explained the production process exactly as she understood it, describing starch, fermentation, distillation, filtration, and careful quality control without ever mentioning the rejected harvest that had started everything. She believed the bottle needed to earn its own reputation. Let me tell you about what changed because it did not begin with a newspaper article or an expensive marketing campaign. It began with chefs. During the late 1990s, restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest began paying closer attention to locally produced ingredients. Diners wanted regional cheeses, regional wines, regional grains, and products connected to the people who grew them. At the same time, a small but steadily expanding craft spirits movement encouraged bartenders to search for bottles carrying authentic agricultural stories instead of anonymous industrial supply chains. Grace found herself arriving at exactly the moment the market had begun asking a question it had never asked before. Who made this, and where did it come from? The answer mattered. Restaurant owners appreciated that every bottle could be traced back to a farming family rather than an international corporation. Food writers discovered the distillery through chefs who admired its consistency. Regional tasting competitions awarded medals for quality rather than production volume. One article published in a Boise newspaper described the vodka as exceptionally clean while highlighting the careful agricultural knowledge behind its production. Another magazine covering specialty food businesses featured the Whitmore Farm as an example of value-added agriculture creating opportunity without expanding acreage. None of those stories mentioned cosmetic grading standards first. They talked about craftsmanship first. Orders increased gradually rather than all at once, but they increased every season. Cases that once sat in storage now shipped within days of bottling. Small retailers reordered before selling through their previous deliveries because customers had begun requesting the label by name. Distributors who had ignored Grace's early phone calls started asking whether additional inventory would become available before the holiday season. One afternoon, while reviewing production schedules inside the distillery office, Grace noticed something she had never expected to see. Demand had finally grown beyond what the current equipment could supply without sacrificing the careful pace that protected quality. She closed the ledger, looked through the office window toward the potato fields surrounding the farm, and quietly realized that the opportunity everyone believed had been rejected years earlier had not disappeared at all. It had simply been waiting for a market capable of recognizing a different definition of value. By the early 2000s, the small bottling room that Grace Whitmore had once worried might never operate at full capacity had become the slowest part of the entire business. The fermentation tanks stayed full, the distillation schedule stretched from early morning until well after sunset, and finished bottles rarely remained in the warehouse longer than a few days before another shipment left the loading dock. What surprised Grace most was not the increase in sales. It was the letters. Customers wrote from Oregon, Colorado, Minnesota, and eventually from states much farther away, describing how they had discovered the bottle while traveling through Idaho or while visiting a restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients. Some asked whether larger quantities would become available. Others wanted to know where they could find another bottle because every nearby retailer had already sold out. Let me tell you about the waiting list, because that was something Grace had never planned to create. It did not begin as a marketing strategy. It began because production could not responsibly grow as quickly as demand. Every batch required the same careful process she had committed to years earlier. Potatoes had to be inspected for quality, washed, prepared, fermented under controlled temperatures, distilled with precise cuts, filtered, tested, and bottled only after every stage met the standards she had written into her notebooks long before the first license had ever been approved. Increasing volume by rushing those steps would have defeated the entire purpose of the business. Instead, distributors agreed to reserve future shipments in advance. Specialty retailers accepted allocations rather than unlimited orders. Restaurants placed requests months before holiday seasons, knowing inventory would be limited. Eventually, a simple notebook beside the office telephone became an organized reservation system recording stores and customers waiting for the next available production run. During one autumn harvest, Grace drove past the same regional packing house that had once classified thousands of pounds of potatoes according to appearance alone. The facility looked much the same as it always had. Forklifts moved between trailers. Conveyors carried fresh harvests through grading equipment. Workers checked loads against familiar specifications. Nothing about the operation appeared unusual until one of the purchasing managers recognized her pickup truck and asked whether she might be interested in purchasing additional irregular potatoes if similar loads became available again. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but Grace understood what had changed. Years earlier, she had asked whether the packing house owned any part of what those potatoes became after leaving the dock. Now the same system that had measured value through cosmetic grading had begun recognizing another market that measured value differently. She thanked the manager, explained the quality standards required for her production process, and agreed to review future opportunities when they fit the distillery's capacity. Driving back toward the Whitmore farm beneath the wide Idaho sky, She passed fields that looked almost identical to the ones her grandfather had first cultivated decades earlier. The land had not changed very much. The potatoes had not changed very much. The science had not changed at all. The greatest change had occurred in the way people defined value. And that single change had quietly transformed a harvest that once waited for rejection into one that customers now patiently waited to receive. Several years later, visitors arriving at the Whitmore farm often expected to find a remarkable new landscape, but they usually left surprised by how ordinary everything appeared. The same irrigation pivots crossed the same fields. The same volcanic soil produced another potato crop each autumn. The same storage buildings stood against the wide Idaho horizon, and the same family ledger, first opened by Samuel Whitmore nearly half a century earlier, continued receiving another season of handwritten entries. Grace Whitmore never described herself as someone who had reinvented farming because she believed she had done something much smaller and much more practical. She had simply refused to confuse appearance with value. Let me tell you about what changed in eastern Idaho, because the greatest transformation did not happen inside the distillery. It happened inside conversations among farmers. At winter extension meetings, growers who had once spoken only about cosmetic grading began asking different questions. Could additional markets exist for crops that failed retail specifications? Could food science create opportunities alongside traditional commodity sales? Could knowledge developed in laboratories become just as valuable on family farms as larger machinery or bigger storage facilities? University researchers began discussing value-added agriculture with greater attention. Agricultural economists pointed to businesses that captured more value by processing crops closer to where they were grown. Younger farmers returned from college carrying ideas that sounded unfamiliar at first, but gradually became part of ordinary conversations. None of those changes happened because one person gave an inspiring speech. They happened because a working example now existed where people could see it with their own eyes. The potatoes themselves had never changed. The chemistry inside them had never changed. The sunlight falling across the Snake River plain each summer had never changed. What changed was the willingness to ask whether an old definition of value still deserved to be the only definition. Grace occasionally thought back to that autumn morning when a dock supervisor answered her unexpected question without realizing its importance. At the time, almost everyone standing on that loading dock believed the story had already reached its conclusion because the grading report had been completed and the decision had been made. In reality, that report had only described the end of one market. It said nothing about the beginning of another. Every industry creates standards because standards solve important problems. They improve efficiency, consistency, and reliability. But standards can also become so familiar that people stop noticing what they leave behind. Sometimes opportunity waits just beyond the edge of a specification sheet, hidden not by mystery, but by habit. Samuel Whitmore once believed that good soil was something a family built one careful season at a time. Grace eventually discovered that value could be built the same way. Not through shortcuts, not through louder advertising, and not by arguing with the system, but by understanding something the system was never designed to measure. Long after customers joined waiting lists for another bottle, the lesson remained much larger than one successful business. Nature had produced the same harvest all along. It simply took someone willing to recognize that the worth of a crop is not always determined by the way it looks when it first reaches the loading dock, but by the knowledge, patience, and imagination of the person who understands what it can still become.